Welcome to another episode of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, a podcast that unearths the forgotten corners of history and brings them back into the light. Each episode goes beyond headlines and textbook dates into the places, decisions, and moments that helped shape our world, even if they were left off the official record. These stories are built from archives, old photographs, and the physical traces still etched into the landscape. Here's your host, photographer, historian, and the creator of Restoration Obscura, John Bulmer.
Welcome to the Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast. I'm John Bulmer, the creator of Restoration Obscura. In this episode of the Field Guide, we're turning our attention to the monster said to inhabit Lake Champlain. People call it Champ, and this creature's inspired sightings, stories, and festivals for more than 2 centuries. Like our earlier episode on the Aber Road Bigfoot incident, Restoration Obscura isn't here to prove or disprove these stories. We're here to look closer at the stories themselves, where they come from, why they persist, and what they reveal about us. Every legend reflects the culture that created it, a mirror showing what we fear, what we hope for, and what we imagine about the world around us. Our journey unfolds in 3 acts. First, we'll explore the early reports of serpents and leviathans on the lake and how 19th century newspapers turned local tales into a national sensation. Then, we'll move down toward the shoreline, into the lived experiences of people who said they saw Champ and how their stories collided with commerce, belief, and doubt. Finally, we'll look at the long cultural afterlife of waterborne monsters, why lakes attract them, how communities embrace them, and what they show us about our enduring need for mystery. This is an episode about folklore and history, about the persistence of wonder in a world that often insists it has no room left for the unknown. Let's begin. Act 1. From horned serpents to ink-stained leviathans. Lake Champlain isn't a quiet lake. It's long, narrow, and restless, stretching for 120 miles between New York and Vermont before tapering into Canada and spilling through the Richelieu River toward the St. Lawrence. Formed at the end of the last ice age, the lake fills a deep scar carved by glaciers more than 10,000 years ago. For a time, it wasn't a lake at all, but an inland sea. Geologists call it the Champlain Sea, a vast saltwater bay of the Atlantic that once flooded inland as the ice retreated. Whales swam here, and their bones still turn up in clay pits around Charlotte, Vermont, reminders that this fresh lake was once saltwater and open to the tides. The land around Champlain is a mosaic of ancient stone. On the Vermont side lie beds of limestone and marble, quarried for centuries and polished into monuments across the northeast. The New York side rises sharply into the Adirondack foothills, home to some of the oldest exposed rock on the continent. That contrast, soft Vermont against rugged New York, gives the lake its tension. It sits between geologies, between climates, and between cultures. The surface changes with the weather. In summer, it glitters like glass, mirroring the ridges around it. In autumn, winds sweep down from the Green Mountains and turn the water gray and choppy. In winter, the lake hardens into ice that once swallowed wagons and served as a frozen road. Spring brings turbulence. Storms churn the surface, flood low shores, and reshape beaches. The lake's never still for long. It shifts with the seasons like something alive. Its ecology is just as intricate. Fed by more than 70 tributaries, Champlain drains a basin that spans New York, Vermont, and Quebec. Over 80 species of fish live here, from pike and bass to ancient sturgeon that predate the dinosaurs. Herons, loons, and ospreys stalk the wetlands. But the lake's under pressure. Runoff feeds algae blooms. Zebra mussels filter the water so efficiently they strip it of plankton, the tiny organisms that feed the food web. Warmer winters thin the ice, disrupting rhythms that communities once depended on. Even the lake's threats reveal its restlessness, forcing people who live along its edge to adapt. For centuries, Champlain's been more than a body of water. It's been a frontier, a military corridor, a line of commerce, and a mirror for the communities built along its shifting surface. The lakes carried armies. During the French and Indian War, it served as a staging ground for campaigns between Britain and France. Wooden sloops bristling with cannons once dotted these waters. Fort Ticonderoga still stands as a reminder of those struggles. During the Revolution, Benedict Arnold's makeshift fleet clashed with the British at Valcour Island in 1776, one of the first naval battles fought by the young republic. During the War of 1812, the Battle of Plattsburgh decided the fate of the northern frontier. American ships blocked a British advance that could have changed the war's outcome. For 2 centuries, Champlain was as much a battleground as it was a highway. It carried soldiers, timber rafts, and news between the St. Lawrence Valley and the Hudson. Its waters have carried the traces of conflict, hard choices, and the long work of staying alive in this place. Its geology shaped the way people moved through this place. Its quiet uncertainty shaped the way they saw themselves in it. Long before settlers drew fortifications or mapped shipping routes, Indigenous people understood the lake as a living presence. The Abenaki told stories of Tataskok, a horned serpent that moves silently through its depths. The Iroquois spoke of beings who dwelled in the water, guardians and omens that commanded respect. These weren't idle tales. They reflected a worldview in which rivers and lakes were treated as living parts of the landscape. To disrespect the waters was to invite danger. The stories taught that the lake was alive, unpredictable, and not to be taken for granted. When Europeans arrived, they brought their own imagination. Scripture gave them Leviathan, the beast of the deep. Norse stories told of Jormungandr, the serpent that encircled the world. Sailors told tales of krakens rising like islands to pull ships under. Along the New England coast, reports of sea serpents were common. In that world, when colonists heard the Abenaki warn of serpents, it was easy to translate those stories into their own language of monsters. The New World became a place where old legends found new water. The first major report of a Champlain monster came in July of 1819 when the Plattsburgh Republican printed an account from a man identified as Captain Crumb. He said he saw something extraordinary near Bulwaga Bay on the New York side. Crumb described a beast stretching 187 feet with a head shaped like a seahorse, pale onion-like eyes, and a mouth armed with 3 jagged teeth. Its body was black and sinuous, following his scow across the bay as if it were in pursuit. The image was unforgettable. A seahorse head paired with the length of a creature bigger than any ship on Champlain. Eyes the size of peeled onions. 3 teeth, almost playful in their strangeness. But in an era obsessed with sea serpents, exaggeration was expected. Just 2 summers earlier in Gloucester, hundreds of people swore they saw a sea serpent rolling through the harbor. Details never matched, and no one cared. It all came back to a simple thing, the feeling of wonder. Crumb's account begged for illustration. Readers could imagine it rising from the water like Leviathan, breaking the calm surface of a familiar world. The press fed that imagination. Early 19th century America was hungry for marvels. Dinosaurs were being named in Europe, and mastodon bones were turning up in New York. To ordinary readers, a living Leviathan in a northern lake felt startling, but possible. The story spread fast. Newspapers reprinted it, some word for word, others with new embellishments. A local sighting became tavern talk in Albany, a parlor curiosity in Boston, and a clipping pinned to a general store wall in Vermont. Each retelling shifted tone, but the idea stuck. Champlain had a monster. For the communities around Bulwaga Bay, that reputation was double-edged. It brought attention and ridicule. But once a story hits print, it gains permanence. It has a dateline, a witness, and the authority of type. The timing was perfect. The early 1800s were an age of exploding print culture. Small papers needed sensation. Monster stories sold. A captain's testimony on the lake felt credible, and readers trusted him. But the story's real power wasn't in what he saw. It was in what people wanted to believe. In hindsight, a 187-foot animal with 3 teeth seems absurd. Yet the image endured. It captured a feeling that Champlain might hide something immense, something alive, waiting in the deep. By the end of that summer, the monster had escaped Bulwaga Bay. It lived in headlines. It joined the American menagerie of wonders, the sea serpents of Gloucester, the monstrous catfish of the Ohio, the wild men of the frontier. The 19th century didn't invent Champ because something new swam in the lake. It invented Champ because the age demanded mystery. The lake offered the stage. The press supplied the spotlight. Imagination did the rest. By the end of the 19th century, Champ had moved from newspaper ink into myth. The monster became part of the lake's identity, as familiar as the ferries that crossed it and the mountains that framed it. For a while, it seemed content to rest there, suspended between folklore and fact. But the story wasn't finished. As cameras replaced sketchbooks and radio spread across the country, the legend surfaced again in a new century, carried by eyewitness stories. In Act 2, we step into the 20th century when lived experience and belief turn Champ from a printed curiosity into a shared encounter on the water. Act 2, the theater of belief. If the 19th century was shaped by newspapers, the 20th was shaped by the stories people lived through and shared firsthand. The story of Champ survived because ordinary people weren't just readers anymore. They gained the ability to visually document. Families drove to picnic sites in station wagons. Kids walked around with Polaroids. Parents recorded home movies on film. Cameras had become accessible. Summer camps lined the Vermont and New York shores. Charter boats offered lake cruises. Lake Champlain was no longer remote. It was accessible, social, and full of potential witnesses. Sightings that once belonged to solitary fishermen in the fog now unfolded in front of families, campers, and tourists. People were ready to tell their stories on radio, television, and eventually the internet. The most famous artifact from this era is the Mansi photograph. In 1977, Sandra Mansi, her fiancé, and their kids pulled over near St. Albans, Vermont to explore the shoreline. Sandra lifted her camera and snapped a picture of a shape rising from the water, a long neck bending against the ripples. The photo spread everywhere. Magazines, paperbacks, television specials. For many people, it was proof. For others, it was a puzzle missing too many pieces. The negative was gone. The shoreline scale was hard to measure. The shape could have been a log. But in the late 1970s, what mattered wasn't perfect evidence. What mattered was how the photo reignited the story. It arrived during a golden age of fringe TV. Americans were glued to In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy. Episodes gave weekly credibility to Bigfoot, UFOs, and psychic phenomena. Bookstore shelves were packed with titles like Chariots of the Gods and Strange Creatures from Time and Space. Right alongside them, readers now found Champ. The 1970s were an era of monsters in popular culture. Bigfoot marched across grainy film in Bluff Creek in 1967, and that footage became a TV staple. The Loch Ness Monster had already gone global, with the surgeon's photo printed on posters and postcards. Drive-in theaters played films like The Legend of Boggy Creek, blending documentary flair with monster encounters. In that cultural moment, the Mansi photo gave Lake Champlain its own star. Champ stepped onto the same stage as Nessie and Sasquatch. The late 20th century brought more sightings. Fishermen near Port Henry swore they saw a massive body roll beneath their boats, the water lifting as if something larger than a sturgeon moved beneath them. Kids at summer camp screamed and pointed as a line of humps crossed the surface. Boaters described wakes slicing through still water as if a huge hull traveled just below the surface. Some of these accounts made the local news. Others stayed private family stories for years until someone finally shared them in an interview. Television carried the legend even further. Vermont and upstate New York stations ran segments whenever sightings clustered, usually in midsummer. Sometimes it aired as a light feature tucked between weather and sports. But the cameras always lingered on the witnesses themselves. Middle-aged couples, wide-eyed kids, local fishermen whose sincerity was tough to dismiss. By the 1980s, Champ had fully joined the cryptid rotation. Documentaries like Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World and later Unsolved Mysteries wove the Champlain monster into montages of unexplained creatures. Some accounts claim that a Japanese TV crew once mounted a sonar search of the lake, maybe in the early 1990s, and found a very large submerged object. But there's no confirmed record that such an expedition took place, or that the data were ever published in a scientific source. Radio gave the legend a home that felt closer to the lake itself. Call-in shows let locals describe their sightings. DJs joked about Champ grabbing breakfast in Bulwaga Bay. But the callers weren't joking. Their voices shook. For them, the memory was seared, the splash, the rolling humps, the eerie quiet. Belief and skepticism circled each other in these decades. Naturalists pointed out that lake sturgeon, armored prehistoric fish that can reach 7 feet, can break the surface like a row of ridges. Otters swimming in a line can mimic a serpent. Logs, currents, and tricks of light can fool the eye. But skeptics rarely convinced the witnesses themselves. A fisherman describing something as long as a boxcar moving beneath his skiff. Campers insisting they saw humps gliding across the water. A grandmother recalling ripples spreading across a calm bay. These weren't thrill seekers or fame hunters. They were neighbors, family, people the community trusted. Their conviction made Champ a lived presence, not just a headline. By the 1980s, Champ had become a civic project. Port Henry built a lakeside statue in 1984, its green body arched like a serpent, facing the water as both a mascot and a sentinel. Burlington launched Champ Day celebrations, blending folklore with summer festival energy. Local newspapers held contests for kids to draw their best version of Champ. Tourist shops sold mugs, hats, postcards, and plush toys. For communities on both shores, Champ became more than a monster. It was a brand, a symbol of pride, a sign that the Champlain Valley held mysteries worth visiting. Beneath the kitsch was something more enduring. Families passed down stories like heirlooms. A grandfather leaning across a porch rail telling a grandson about the day he saw the water bulge in 1939. A camp counselor sharing a moonlit story about ripples that came from nowhere, making kids stare wide-eyed at the water. Parents opening scrapbooks, showing yellowed clippings from the Burlington Free Press or the Plattsburgh Press Republican. This is what people saw when I was your age. These accounts held families to the lake, stitching memory to place. The cultural resonance deepened in the 1990s and early 2000s. Champ appeared regularly on the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, and Animal Planet. He showed up alongside Nessie and Ogopogo in countdowns of lake monsters of the world. These specials framed Champ as part of a global pantheon, guardians of deep cold waters. Among them, Ogopogo stood out as a powerful parallel. Said to inhabit British Columbia's Okanagan Lake, Ogopogo traces back to the Syilx people, who told of a water spirit called Inha-Itki. We'll dig deeper into Ogopogo in Act 3. Back on Champlain, the legend kept spreading. The Burlington minor league baseball team rebranded as the Vermont Lake Monsters, with a cartoon Champ as their mascot. Kids' books, comic books, and paranormal paperbacks folded Champ into American folklore. For kids growing up in Vermont or upstate New York, Champ wasn't just a story. Champ was a neighbor. Champ belonged to Lake Champlain. But by the end of the century, Champ belonged to pop culture too. An American cryptid swimming alongside Bigfoot and Nessie in the imagination of millions. Champ may be rooted in Lake Champlain, but the story doesn't end at the water's edge. The power of a lake monster, like any enduring folklore, isn't confined to a place or a name. It appears wherever deep water meets deep imagination. The farther you look, the clearer it becomes that Champ is part of a much older, wider pattern, a pattern that spans oceans and centuries. In Act 3, we'll follow that pattern, from the serpents of ancient China to the kelpies of Scotland, from the underwater panthers of the Great Lakes to the long-bodied beasts of Nordic fjords. We'll explore how cultures explain what might be lurking in deep water. We'll look at why humans imagine monsters in the depths, how these legends form in specific landscapes, and what they reveal about fear, belief, and the psychology of the unknown. Because every lake has a legend, and every legend tells us something about the people who carry it. That's where we go in Act 3. Act 3, in the company of Leviathans. To understand Champ, we have to step back and look at the larger tradition of lake monsters. They're everywhere, mapped across cultures and centuries. Loch Ness in Scotland has Nessie, whose fame exploded in the 1930s, but grew from centuries of stories about kelpies and water horses. Iceland's Lagerflöt has its worm, first described in 14th century chronicles, said to coil beneath a glacial river and erupt when disturbed. Canada's Okanagan Lake has Ogopogo, a serpent rooted in Syilx oral tradition long before it became a tourist emblem. In Scandinavia, lakes and fjords are filled with serpentine lore, from the Shormer to lake drags that haunted old stories. Even in the United States, legends cling to lakes from Minnesota's Pepe of Lake Pepin to California's Tahoe Tessie. Why do lakes generate monsters? Part of the answer lies in the nature of water itself. A lake is familiar and unknown at the same time. Its surface is a mirror that hides what moves beneath. Its depths are opaque, and what rises from them, a fish, a log, a ripple, can never be fully trusted. Water distorts scale and distance. A ripple becomes a wake. A floating branch becomes a head. What can't be explained in a moment of shock is often remembered as something otherworldly. That ambiguity, repeated across cultures, invites imagination. But there's more than optics involved. Monsters serve cultural needs. They guard places. They remind us that the environment is alive, unpredictable, and deserving of respect. In indigenous traditions across the Northern Hemisphere, serpents and water spirits often carried warnings. Respect the water. Don't trespass lightly. Don't disturb what you can't see. In European folklore, water horses and kelpies lured the careless to their deaths, growing out of fishing villages where drowning was a daily danger. Each culture projected its fears into the water: fear of storms, fear of scarcity, fear of loss. In the 19th century, when scientific discovery raced ahead, sea serpent panics often reflected cultural uncertainty. The Gloucester serpent of 1817 appeared when Americans were redefining their nation and their place in the natural world. Reports of serpents in the North Atlantic rose during whaling voyages that pushed further into dangerous waters. In Victorian Britain, Nessie surged in popularity in the interwar years when industrial depression and the trauma of World War I left people hungry for distraction, and that often manifested as wonder. Monsters, in this sense, are cultural barometers. They surface when societies face uncertainty. They offer distraction and meaning. Champ fits neatly into this global pattern. To the Champlain Valley, Champ is more than an unexplained shape in the water. Champ is a guardian of place, a reminder that the lake isn't just scenery, but an ecosystem with depth and power. Even when naturalists explain sightings as sturgeon, otters, or currents, the deeper meaning remains. People want to believe their waters still hold mysteries. Belief isn't undone by explanation. It's nourished by the refusal of the lake to give up all its secrets. There's also a philosophical dimension. To believe in a lake monster is to resist a world that insists everything should be measured, cataloged, and fully explained. It's to carve out a place where mystery is allowed to endure. It's to hold open the idea that the world isn't entirely under our control. The Restoration Obscura Field Guide to the Night explored how darkness invites imagination and how shadows preserve memory. Lakes work the same way. They're places where what's unseen still holds possibility. The 20th century, with its sonar rigs and grainy photographs, didn't end the mystery. It amplified it. The Mansi photograph was debated and dissected, but it lives on because it asks more questions than it answers. Much like the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot footage, television specials brought sonar and underwater cameras to the search. A 2003 Unsolved Mysteries segment, a History's Mysteries episode, and others tried to probe the depths. But even advanced tools left gaps, revealing only shapes and disturbances that defied easy classification. Each new probe deepened the sense that the lake is a stage where something might still emerge. In 2010, Jeremy Wade, host of River Monsters, came to Lake Champlain to investigate Champ with a scientific lens. Wade, a biologist known for tracking myths of dangerous freshwater creatures, asked a different question. Not whether monsters exist, but what real animals might inspire the stories. He suggested that Champ sightings might come from giant gar or sturgeon, fish that look prehistoric, move slowly, and can grow large enough to startle a boater. Wade's method fits a broader shift in how we look at monsters today. Not as creatures to prove or disprove, but as expressions of cultural memory rooted in real biology. Popular culture has followed this evolution. Monsters have never needed to be fantastical to carry weight. The whale that sank the Essex in 1820 was a known animal, a sperm whale. Yet it became mythic in Melville's Moby Dick as something larger than nature. Jaws did the same with a great white shark, turning a real predator into a symbol of cultural fear. Neither creature was cryptozoological, but both became monsters in the cultural sense. Terror doesn't always rise from mystery. Sometimes it swims in plain sight, and we build legends around it. For Champ, the environmental dimension adds another layer. As the lake faces pollution, invasive species, and warming waters, Champ becomes a metaphor for resilience. If the monster can survive, maybe the ecosystem can too. And if the lake loses its health, what else is lost with it? Even as folklore, Champ reminds people that the lake is alive and deserves care. Belief becomes a form of stewardship, a way of insisting the lake is more than a backdrop. Philosophically, Champ endures because it speaks to something ancient in us. We're drawn to the edge of water to peer at reflections, to wonder what lies beneath. We feel awe at the idea that something unknown might still swim in familiar places. Champ combines memory, metaphor, and mystery into one mysterious, nebulous thing. Proof isn't the point. The story endures because it fills a human need, the need to believe the world is larger than our explanations, the need to imagine possibility when certainty runs dry. As we close, picture the lake at dusk. The Adirondacks sinking into shadow on one side, the Green Mountains settling on the other. A loon calls across the water. The surface lies still, except for a ripple, a roll, a shadow that glides across the glass. For a moment, you see something you can't explain, and then it's gone. That fleeting moment is why Champ matters. Because it reminds us that even in familiar places, wonder waits just beneath the surface. Because it shows that mystery can be a form of memory. Because it proves that some stories are less about what rises from the depths and more about what stirs in us when we look across the water and imagine. This has been the Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast. I'm John Bulmer. Thanks for joining me as we explored Champ, the Lake Champlain monster, and the leviathans of the world. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Please rate and share. It helps more people discover our content. You can get weekly articles delivered to your inbox by subscribing at restorationobscura.com. Join me next time as we uncover another story buried in history, memory, and place. Until then, keep your eyes on the water. Take care. I'm excited to share that my new book, Restoration Obscura's Field Guide to the Night, is now available. This project grew out of the same work you hear on this podcast. It's an immersive history of how night has shaped human experience, from the first sky watchers and their constellations, to the wartime blackouts that changed daily life, to the hidden surveillance networks of the Cold War. It's part cultural history, part personal journey, and it invites us to step beyond today's artificial glow and rediscover what still lives in the shadows. Field Guide to the Night is available worldwide in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. If you've been enjoying the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, our deep dives into forgotten history, lost infrastructure, and the legends of the past, there's a way to be part of the story behind the scenes. We're currently welcoming select sponsorship partners for upcoming episodes and articles. Whether you're an independent brand, museum, publisher, archive, or just someone who believes in the power of storytelling, this is your chance to reach an engaged, history-loving audience across Substack, Facebook, Instagram, and all major streaming platforms. If your mission aligns with ours, preserving the past, exploring the overlooked, or just digging deeper than the headlines, we'd love to connect. For sponsor opportunities and media inquiries, contact restorationobscura@gmail.com. Let's bring more forgotten stories to light together. If you believe history is worth preserving, if you've ever paused at the ruins of an old mill or held a faded photograph and wondered about the world it came from, this space is for you. The Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast streams on all major platforms. Subscribe to support independent, reader-funded storytelling at restorationobscura.com. Copyright 2025, John Bulmer Media and Restoration Obscura. All rights reserved. Restoration Obscura explores forgotten places and overlooked histories. Visiting abandoned sites can be dangerous, unstable, and often illegal. This podcast does not encourage or endorse trespassing, vandalism, or unsafe exploration. Please respect property laws, community safety, and historic preservation efforts. Restoration Obscura draws on a range of materials, including public archives, institutional holdings, and privately preserved collections. Many images and documents have uncertain or incomplete provenance. When possible, sources are identified and credited. While we work to preserve and interpret these materials with care, not all rights of ownership reside with Restoration Obscura. All information is verified as accurate at the time of publication.
This was a Restoration Obscura broadcast. Archive reference terminated. Operation complete. Restoration Obscura signing off.